Welcome to Bible Study Insights with @BibleStudyCam, and I'm BibleStudyCam, and I want to welcome you to this live stream event where we take a few minutes and focus in on a passage or parable or something out of the Gospels and together focus our perspective onto God and beyond all of the craziness that's happening in the world today. And this morning, this Tuesday morning, if I've gotten my days correct, we're looking at Matthew chapter 22, and we're going to be looking at verses 1 through 14, where Jesus shares a parable about a wedding banquet where a lot of things don't go as planned. So let's read this parable and discover what are a few things that we can learn in what Jesus shared. This is Matthew chapter 22, and I'm going to read from the New International Version. Verse 1, Jesus spoke to them again in parable, saying, "The kingdom of heaven is like a king who prepared a wedding banquet for his son. He sent his servants to those who had been invited to the banquet to tell them to come, but they refused to come. Then he sent some more servants and said, 'Tell those who have been invited that I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and fattened cattle have been butchered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding banquet.' But they paid no attention and went off, one to his field, another to his business. The rest seized his servants, mistreated them, and killed them. The king was enraged. He sent his army and destroyed those murderers and burned their city." Now that's challenging if you think about it, because when we're looking at this event, these guys who the king believed to be his friends, he had given them an invitation to this wedding banquet. They mistreat his servants and kill some servants, and it's like they are standing opposite. They're rebelling against the king. And so it's not a surprise in my mind, even if it's a little harsh, to see that the king would have such a strong reaction to these guys who mistreated and killed his servants. But verse 8, "Then he said to his servants, 'The wedding banquet is ready, but those I invited did not deserve to come.'" And that's kind of an understatement because of how they treated his servants and how they blew him off. Verse 9, "So go to the street corners and invite to the banquet anyone you find.' So the servants went out into the streets and gathered all the people they could find, the bad as well as the good. And the wedding hall was filled with guests." Now, if the parable ended here, this would be an amazing illustration of God's inclusiveness for all. When those who were originally invited rejected this invitation that they were given, this amazing invitation, it opened up the way for anyone and everyone, the bad and the good, the rich and the poor, everyone on an equal plane. If you were interested in coming, you were invited. But this parable doesn't end here. And it almost takes a more disturbing or a darker turn, you might say, when we move into the second half of this parable. Verse 11, "But when the king came in to see the guests," now this is feasibly as the banquet is beginning and all the guests are seated there, "when the king came in to see the guests, he noticed a man there who was not wearing wedding clothes. He asked, 'How did you get in here without wedding clothes, friend?' The man was speechless. Then the king told the attendants, 'Tie him hand and foot and throw him outside into the darkness where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are invited, but few are chosen.'" Now, this is challenging in my mind because on one hand, the opening to this parable, even though the king kind of got burned by those he thought were his friends, he opens this invitation to everyone, and this is an amazingly inclusive parable. But then when we move to the second half of this parable, the last portion, a guy gets kicked out because he is not wearing the proper attire. And that's strange in my mind. Because when we look at the details that are given in the first half of the parable, anyone and everyone were invited. The rich and the poor, the good and the bad. It doesn't matter what your past was, you were invited. Those people were invited. And in my own sanctified or maybe not so sanctified imagination, some of the poor people who may have just been passing by on the street, going from shop to shop, just doing their whatever they would normally be doing, they wouldn't have had time to go back and get dressed because of the urgent nature of this request, nor would they have even had wedding clothes worthy of being fit for the king's banquet hall. And really with the urgency of this request, everything was ready. If they had allowed people to go home, or if they had suggested, oh yeah, go home and get ready and then come, then it's likely that the food would have spoiled because the food was ready and they didn't have the same sort of refrigeration tactics that we have today to keep food preserved for just a little bit longer. But then, where does that leave the second half of the parable? Because there's a little bit of a disconnect, because when we open the second half of the parable, the king comes into this wedding banquet hall filled with guests, and everybody but one person has wedding clothes on. And the only way that this detail makes sense, at least in my own mind, is if we add a detail that's not included in the parable that says that those guests who arrived at the banquet, before they entered into the wedding hall, or the banquet hall, you could say, they were given the gift of wedding clothes, which would then allow everyone to be present with wedding clothes in the banquet hall, except for this one guy who said, no, the clothes I got on are good enough. I put on the best that I had for you, and I don't need any different wedding clothes. But as we learn in the details of this parable, the rejection of the gift of wedding clothes was this guy's ultimate mistake, you could say. The big mistake. Because by rejecting the wedding clothes, he gets kicked out of the banquet. He's even speechless because he likely knew that, yeah, he probably should have, especially since he had on the best that he had, but apparently that wasn't good enough for the king, and he gets kicked out. So what then do the wedding clothes mean for us today? In my own mind, as I've studied this out and as I've done little bits of research on different parts of the Bible that relate to wedding banquets, to unpack and perhaps understand this parable a little bit better, the wedding clothes, in my mind, represent Jesus' righteousness. Jesus' righteousness that he offers to us when we come to him. Now, in the book of Revelation, near the end, I think it may be in chapters 19 or 20 or somewhere in there, a wedding banquet is described. And I have reason to believe, there's logical reasons to believe, that the wedding banquet that's described in the book of Revelation in those chapters is also the same wedding banquet that Jesus describes in some of his parables. And in one of the most cryptic books in the entire Bible, John actually openly states, without using any figurative language, that wedding clothes, at least in Revelation, symbolize the righteous acts of God's people. But then, when we look at that, or when we bring that into our discussion, does that mean that the best we can do, all of the great things that we do in the world around us, those things are going to make it and get us into heaven? I highly doubt that, because there's plenty of places in the Bible that directly challenge that understanding. Instead, I believe that the gift of the wedding clothes is Jesus giving us his righteousness, because he is the only one, he says, God is the only one who could even be considered good. And Jesus is the only one who ever lived a perfectly righteous life. And in that perfectly righteous life, Jesus died to take our punishment so that we would be able to accept his gift of his life, his gift of his clothing, and his gift of his perfection, you might say, in exchange for our sin-stained, sin-filled, maybe even sin-predisposed clothing and character. And when we accept God's invitation, we are saying, hey, God, Jesus, the Holy Spirit, come and live in my heart and my life. And when we accept the gift of clothing, we're saying, God, Jesus, the Holy Spirit, transform my life into being the life that you want me to live. transform me into having the character that you want me to have, and transform me into having the focus and the perspective on life that you want me to have. And when we do this, when we let God transform us from the inside out through the working of His Holy Spirit, we're putting on the clothes that allow us to stay in the banquet after we've accepted the invitation to the banquet, and this banquet launches us into this incredible adventure with God throughout eternity. Remember, when we accept Jesus into our hearts and into our lives and into our minds, we will outlast this sin-filled world. We will outlast the sin and the pain and the disease and the pandemics and the death and all the crazy social isolating to try to minimize the spread of all of this junk, you could say, all of this disease. Because in God's perfectly recreated new heaven and new earth, we won't have any of the bad that our world has in it today. And we won't have any of this distancing, because we will be together with God forever on the adventure of eternity. And so those are a couple of the things that I wanted to draw our attention to, and I want to re-emphasize that heaven is not something we earn through doing good things. It is entirely given to us as a gift based on what Jesus accomplished for us. And so whether you're tuning in here on Twitter or Periscope at BibleStudyCam, whether you're on Facebook.com/Reflective Bible Study, whether you're at YouTube at The Online Preacher, or even at theonlinepreacher.com/live, wherever you happen to be tuning in, I want to thank you for just being here with me for this message as we together refocus our hearts and our minds and our perspectives past the craziness of today and onto God's perspective. And I want to also invite you to keep the conversation going, and if I've shared something that has resonated with you or that I may have missed as I was sharing, jump into any of the places that have comment boxes, and I'll jump in there and interact with you after we finish this broadcast. Because while the world is crazy, let's together stay connected digitally, and let's together keep our minds and our hearts and our eyes focused on Jesus. And if this message has challenged you or inspired you, and you know someone who would be interested in or maybe benefited by hearing or watching this message, then please share this message with them, because I want to help you help them keep our perspective and our hope alive as this world is losing hope and losing just sanity, you might say. And as we focus on Jesus, our hope is encouraged, our hope is strengthened, and we are able to make steps forward. Not just today, but steps moving into eternity. So thanks for tuning in, and we'll be back tomorrow morning at about this time to look at another passage from the Gospels as we keep moving forward together with Jesus.